you see actors playing very similar roles all the time. You see directors directing very similar types of movies. Now, one could say, well, that's just what they love to do. And one could argue that that's okay. I'm sure there's an industry topic to talk about too, but I was thinking about just an interesting thing that has happened recently to us on a couple of different things. And we even touched on it in our interview last week with Charlie and Vloss. Anyone who didn't catch that interview, it's fantastic. So
it's a really so the episode's 1 hour and a half, but it's really, really, really good. For those who don't know, Vloss and Charlie Polipanides wrote Death Note on Netflix and also Blood of Zeus, their show. Immortals as well. And they're great. And they're so wise and kind and generous and knowledgeable. And it's a really good episode. So if you haven't seen it, do make sure you go and check that out after you watch this or listen to this.
Yes, definitely. And one of the things that came up was this idea of ideas that we would have on older projects that then kind of blend into what you're working on at that moment. And part of it is sometimes going back and like legitimately just taking an old idea as we've talked about.
Knowing that you're doing so. Why don't we
knowing that you're doing it
and go and put that in here? Yeah.
And then sometimes it just happens and you go, oh, I didn't realize how close these two things are.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I kind of feel like it's your unconscious mind playing out stuff that's going on inside of it. Right. And I think what you and I have on a pretty consistent basis is we kind of glom onto things that we're both kind of feeling at the time. And we often say, oh, I'm so glad you said that because I'm feeling the same way. Right. So I think, we're in this kind of symbiotic relationship whereby we both kind of have these similar feelings and by like similar thematic ideas. I absolutely feel that when we first started working together, we were very much drawn to a certain type of hero in our pieces. And after a while, we would laugh because we began to identify, oh, this is another reluctant hero story. Oh, here we go again. A selfless character who's a reluctant hero over the course of the movie.
Selfish and selfless.
And selfless. That was a lot. I think probably about 3 or 4 movies we wrote that were that basically. Yeah. And then interestingly, as you the thing that I think you're probably referencing was we went back and revisited an old pitch last week and we're like, oh my goodness, there are elements of that in Hellfire, the project that we're working on right now.
Yes. And we had not read that pitch in 2.5 years. So it was funny because, obviously we said, and we did come to this podcast without knowing what we were going to write, but without consciously doing it, aspects from other movies bleeded in. There's elements in this that we acknowledged earlier that we didn't even realize we were doing from another pitch that we had another script that we were going to write, a spec-ish that we had been talking about. And all of a sudden we were like, oh shit, we're like using a bunch of stuff from that. Or, there's variations of different, whether it's structural, whether it's character, whether it's a specific set piece or a plot point or whatever, that you just kind of find like going through the course of like multiple projects.
Right.
And I don't think it's a bad thing, but I'm curious what you think in terms of like, is it okay for writers in general to have lots of movies or screenplays that would hopefully one day become movies with very similar like themes or characters or plots? Like, does
it's a good question, isn't it? It's a good question because one could argue, let's say you wrote 3 specs in a year and they all hit, and for whatever reason they all hit the marketplace 1 month after the next, which can happen sometimes. And we've dealt with situations whereby we've gone, hang on a minute, is this going to be going out too close to this project? in theory, you know, people could read that script and go, oh, it's very similar thematically to the last thing that they had go out. You know, we are toying around with an idea at the moment that might live not necessarily thematically, but kind of conceptually to another movie that we've written. Mm-hmm. I think from a thematic place, I think you, the writer, we, the writers, see it much more kind of clearly than perhaps a reader does. And that a reader will be looking at concept first and movie first, and thematic stuff as a secondary thought. You know, rather than saying, this is a movie about a reluctant hero, a reluctant, selfish hero who over the course of the movie becomes selfless. Well, that's just a film trope in general.
Yeah.
Name 100 movies that do that with heroes. So the answer is, in terms of thematic and character arc stuff, I don't think it is a problem.
Yeah, I don't think theme is an issue, because that could just be, look, this writer likes to explore that part of the human condition, and that's okay. But I also wonder, and this is just kind of there is a part of Hollywood in general, and it goes beyond even screenwriters. I mean, you could look at actors and directors and people who Hollywood wants you to do the same but different, right? There's an aspect of going, oh, we've talked about brand a lot in the past, right? Oh, this is your brand. And it's something that our representation has brought up, which is like, give us another one of those. And you see actors playing very similar roles all the time. You see directors directing very similar types of movies. Now, one could say, well, that's just what they love to do. And one could argue that that's okay. I mean, I go, well, as long as the whole thing isn't literally exactly the same, is it okay to tell a very similar story with a few major differences that then influence the overall thing? But if you look at the two, you could gotta go, yeah, all right, they're kind of telling the same story here.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk a little bit sometimes about John Wick and Nobody, written both by our friend Derek Kolstad. And there are a lot of similarities between those movies. They're both excellent and individual in their own way, and obviously very different, but also structurally, you go, oh, there's a lot of things that feel like they're the same, you know? And I love both of those movies, you know?
So that's the thing, is I go, you know, as creatives, I think things do slip in that you don't even consciously go, oh, this is the same as what I did before.
Right.
Should you fight against that? Or should you embrace it and go, actually, this is what I
do really well.
And I enjoy it, and I'm having fun doing it. So if there's a career to be had doing the same thing, but really enjoying doing it, be the guy who does those movies. I mean, I'll use, you know, one of my favorite directors right now is Denis Villeneuve, and arguably he's the guy who does big, giant sci-fi that's beautifully shot and visually amazing.
A bit heady. Yeah.
And a bit heady. Yeah. Blade Runner 2049, it's Dune Parts 1 and Part 2, and you go,
it's Arrival.
It's Arrival, right? Sure. And so you go.
What's interesting is before that, he didn't do that. Before Arrival, he didn't do that. But yeah, I think at the moment he absolutely.
No, but I mean, like right now, yeah, like he's like, and when you talk about another, like we're talking about a big sci-fi project, and the producer was like, well, you know, there's only one Denis Villeneuve out there.
Right.
And you're like, well, yeah, but like, I mean, is that okay to then? I mean, I think it's okay. I love watching his movies, and I would want to watch him do more of the same.
Yeah,
the stories aren't identical, obviously.
I think of what did he direct before Arrival? Was it Brothers? I forget the name of the movie, but there was it was like a really good drama. And I go, well, he segued from that into doing a really good drama that happened to be sci-fi. You know?
Yeah, I wonder what I'm blanking. I don't know the movie Brothers, so I couldn't.
Yeah, it might not have been, but it's something like that. But it was, really, it's he did a very, very good drama. Then did a very good drama that had an absolute science fiction thing going on with it. And then lent even more into the science fiction aspect when he did Blade Runner 2049. And then does
it was Sicario
with Dune. So it was like each time it was one more if you just went straight from whatever that movie was, did you find what
Sicario is what you're thinking of?
And I think yes. Okay.
And there was also Prisoners and another movie. Yeah.
So those kinds of movies, great movies. Prisoners is a fantastic movie.
Right.
But then these worlds getting big. If you were to say, Dune from the director of Prisoners, you'd be like, what?
Yeah.
You go Dune from the director of Blade Runner and Arrival, you go, yeah, cool, got it. So anyway, bringing that back to screenwriting, and we talk about this. So, and we, the way that we did it was with The Princess. The Princess was an interesting experiment for us because in the past, previously, we had our bread and butter, our brand was taking well-known IP, Santa Claus, Arabian Nights, H.G. Wells, things like that, and putting a spin on it. But the way we did it with The Princess was fairy tale princess. It was more done with a trope than it was an exact. And we were like, well, what if it's an action? What if it's an R-rated action movie? We hadn't written an R-rated action or sold an R-rated action movie before. This is a new thing. So it was that, and then it's that. And interestingly, our new project that we were outlining this morning does it even more. It's not Winter's Night, and it's not even The Princess, but it takes a concept that and does something fun in an action movie sense with it.
Yeah.
So one other thing that's actually furthest away from quote unquote our brand, and yet still fits our brand because of what we created with The Princess.
Sure.
I don't think you should go from writing a horror to a romantic comedy. But could you write a horror romantic comedy? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll use an example of a friend of ours, the great John Spates, speaking of Dune.
Sure.
And now I haven't read anything that he sold actually as a spec, to be honest. But his resume, if you look at his resume, it's all big adaptation, science fiction, big worlds, big expense. I mean, literally, I guess Passengers was a spec, wasn't it?
Passengers was a fantastic spec.
Yeah. But then it's like Prometheus, Doctor Strange, even The Mummy, Dune Part 2. He's got a reputation, and a very good reputation, of being able to deliver on a specific kind of movie.
Yes.
And he would be one of the go-to writers if a studio is going, hey, we want to adapt this property. It's got a lot of world building, a lot of visual shit in there. It's a little heady. We definitely want it to feel smart and not it's an adult movie.
Yeah.
Who do we go to? Well, one of the first names that's going to come up is John's.
Totally.
But that's because he's also been doing it now for a long time and stayed within that brand.
Totally. And again, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's a slight diversion from the conversation because we're now talking about branding.
Well, yes, but it's the way in which you idea. I don't think it's about theme. I think it's the way. I think it's more conceptual. I really do. I think it's about even the things that I was talking about earlier, whereby they were slipping into the movies that we were talking about, like even the even what we're working on now, Hellfire, and having things that were like, oh wow,
Oh, that's
it was
interesting.
less thematic than it is concept, plot, character. It's like the type of movie that it is,
Totally.
you know,
Yeah.
and so I'm just going, hey, well, on the one hand, I think there's a version where you just go embrace it, and if things slip and blend, and oh, you have this great idea. Oh, well, it's very similar, but it's not the same. But it's
Yeah.
very similar. That's okay.
I think that's okay. I think what one should be aware of if you are exploring similar thematic ideas is that you're not just falling into the groove that exists because you've already explored it in something else. I think if you can find way, like for example, you had a really great idea about the concept that we were talking about this morning. There was a really interesting twist that we didn't go into this knowing. You know, concept is this, and it's going to be this, and this is going to be the character way in. And then you were like last week, what if that character's the villain? And it was like, oh, that's great. And you didn't know that going into it at all. That's just an example. It's not the best example, but it's kind of going like, there are new discoveries to be made. Even if you're exploring similar thematic ideas, you can explore them in different ways and through different characters that do different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of talking about two different things. Like, I really don't think it's about thematic ideas. I think you can explore the same thematic idea in a bazillion different genres. You know, so it's not that. It's more about the style, tone, structure, like as you were saying before, like, you know, we were writing things that were, hey, let's take this thing and turn it into this thing, you know. Someone once called it subversive badassery. You know, and I think that there is, and we continue to be pushed to continue it within that. And that is, yes, it's brand, but it's only brand because the ideas that we generate start to blend into each other because they're all kind of doing the same thing.
Of course, absolutely.
You know, oh, hey, you're the guy that writes about, you know, you're like gritty crime dramas. Give me another gritty crime drama. Well, gritty crime dramas have tropes. A lot of them are the same. There's only so many ways you can skin the cat. And while you might create a completely new character in a different city, and maybe it's going to be like, you know, a different time period or a different that, you'll probably end up having moments eventually that blend over your story. You know, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is going like, oh, well, if you're talking about taking a, you know, some sort of genre trope and flipping it on its head, or if you're talking about taking something, you know, and doing something different with it, well, they tend to be similar. Like, we've even talked about this in terms of, well, how do we make them a badass? Well, that's the same.
Yeah, that's the same. Totally, absolutely right.
Same kind of gimmick in a way.
Absolutely.
You know?
Totally right. How do you make Santa Claus a badass? How do you make a fairy tale princess a badass? How do you make a badass?
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's just an interesting thing to, and then as you write those stories, obviously, I think that you want to try and keep them as fresh and as new as possible. I think as a writer, like you said, it's like you go, ooh, that would be cool. That would be different. We haven't seen that before. We're always looking for those moments.
Yeah.
And then there's also things that just work. And they work because they work.
Yeah.
You know? Like if you're going to do a character and you're going to subvert this nice character and make them into a badass, you're going to want to have certain moments that give us the thing that's going to allow that to happen.
Sure.
So anyway, it's interesting to look at the couple of specs that we're working on right now, and even just thinking about it from a business perspective, going, is that good for a career?
Right.
And I would argue it can be.
Can be.
And also, I guess, could not be if what you're writing is like too similar all the time.
Yeah.
Although there's probably people with amazing careers who write the exact same type of movie every single time. Like literally like paint by numbers.
Yeah.
You know, I couldn't call them out right now, but we all see those movies, right? We all go, oh, like this movie feels exactly like that movie, which feels exactly like that movie. And you just literally, it's like paint by numbers movies.
Sure.
And
you don't want that.
You don't want that.
No. And again, counterpoint is if those movies sell and people enjoy those movies, then
that's exactly what I mean.
The way up, isn't it?
Exactly what I mean. Like, is that such a bad thing?
Yeah.
Be able to have a career as a screenwriter and enjoy painting by numbers?
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, like maybe it's not the most artistically fulfilling.
Well, and again, there's one thing, isn't there? It's like if it is quote unquote painting by numbers, and now's the scene where I think why there's been so much rejection of things like the Save the Cat structure, for example, is because people go, well, that just feels like painting by numbers. But when you watch a lot of movies, you go, well, a lot of these things do get met. I don't think they were looking at Save the Cat structure when they wrote them, but I think what Blake Snyder, who wrote Save the Cat, was doing was trying to identify those things.
Well, there's common things about stories. Stories have
common things about stories.
Yeah.
And yet I don't like going and writing that list out, which is something perhaps we did in our early career, writing that list out and going, well, this needs to happen here. There needs to be a thing that happened here. But do we talk about darkest moments in stories? Yes. Absolutely. Of course we do. Because those are things that happen in all good movies. There is a moment where, quote unquote, all is lost. And you go, how are they going to get out of this one?
Yeah.
You know, those things happen in all the best movies.
Right. Because it's funny too, because you're dealing as a professional screenwriter, you're working with other people. Obviously, it's a collaborative art. You're working with producers, and we were just having a great call with a producer the other day, very successful producer, who was talking about, well, I always look at structure and I always try and find that darkest moment point. And then he was saying, but he talked to this other incredible producer who told him actually the way he's like, I make movies based on midpoints.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fascinating. Like they're looking at it also from, well, we need something to happen here that is the same as what normally happens in these kinds of movies.
Sure.
At the middle of the movie, the character needs to make a turn whereby they start to go on, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And they found that works.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And ultimately, I think what's interesting about storytelling, and they say that there's the old line, it's like there are no new stories.
Yeah.
Right? There's only variations on the same. I can't remember what it's like 10 stories or something like that.
I have a great book by Christopher Booker called The 7 Basic Plots.
Right. And I think that's the same thing. It's like when you're writing all the time and you're coming up with new ideas all the time, stuff is going to naturally blend from one project to the other because there's only so many stories to tell. There's only so many ways to tell them. You're pretty much always going to have a midpoint, and you're pretty much always going to have some form of a all is lost.
Because it's about how you keep the audience engaged. Oh, here's something new. Here's a new piece of information. Oh, it's now gotten even harder. You don't want to be like, and then it was really easy at the end of Act 2, and then there was nothing that they were really going for in Act 3 because it doesn't make sense. You need to have constant stakes. Again, in book writing, there is the belief that and like people like Dan Brown absolutely do this. Cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. Like, oh, how is he going to get out of this one?
Mm.
You know, and dates back to the old serials of the 1940s and 50s. That's why they're called cliffhangers. Because the movie would end, the episode would end with a character hanging on to the edge of a cliff. Tune in next week to find out if Flash Gordon can get out of this one.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, it's true.
But yeah, I do think that can be creatively unfulfilling to paint by numbers and fall into those own things. But what you will find, and we absolutely find, is regardless of whether or not we're quote unquote painting by numbers, which I don't think we ever do, but we do find natural beats occurring because you want certain things to be happening. And someone can zoom out and go, well, you're just doing the movie structure. And you go, yeah, because I'm writing a movie.
Yeah. You're just doing that. Yes, I am. You're right.
You're just writing a screenplay.
You're right. I have a protagonist. You got me. You got me. Wait, there's a villain in that movie.
Yeah. You're just copying that because you read that in some book.
You're right. I have villains in my movies. So unoriginal.
Damn you.
Anyway. All right. Speaking of villains and movies, actually, I don't think we're talking villains, but we are going to go into our movie now, unless there's anything else.
No.
Discuss.
Nothing.
So